Iván Rodríguez didn't simply climb to the summit of baseball as a brief sensation, but as a benchmark that endured for more than 20 years. A catcher whose name carried numbers heavy with history. He stepped onto a major league field for the first time at only 19, and from that moment forward, he reshaped the modern catcher position entirely, not just through defense, but through a rare sense of total completeness. Iván Rodríguez captured 14 Gold Gloves, more than any catcher ever, a testament to his almost flawless defensive mastery behind home plate. He earned selection to 13 All-Star games and secured 7 Silver Slugger awards, placing him among the few catchers who paired elite defense with steady offensive production. In 1999, he received the American League MVP award, an honor so uncommon for a catcher that it was nearly unprecedented. Then, in 2003, he served as the emotional anchor who steered the Florida Marlins to a World Series title, where his calm presence, experience, and command of the game formed the backbone of the entire roster. More than 2,800 hits and over 300 home runs defined a career that stretched across multiple teams, yet consistently upheld the same uncompromising standard. The ultimate peak arrived when he was voted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in his first year of eligibility, a definitive acknowledgement of a career that was not only extraordinary, but relentlessly sustained. Yet behind those shining statistics, at 54 years old, Iván Rodríguez wakes to a different reality, one where past triumphs no longer allow his body to move with the effortless fluidity once had. His knees creak quietly when he rises. His lower back tightens after decades spent kneeling tens of thousands of times, and the hands that once received 100-mile-per-hour fastballs now live with a steady, muted ache. Iván's pain isn't the result of a single incident, but the slow accumulation of years of discipline. The days he chose to play while his body was already sounding warnings. The seasons that left no room for a catcher to appear fragile or to rest. What keeps him upright, however, isn't a longing for trophies. It's the will that was forged early in his life. No complaints, no deserting the role, no excuses. He adapted to pain the way he once adapted to pressure on the field, refining each movement, accepting the slower tempo of his body, yet never permitting himself to see the cost he paid as meaningless. Iván isn't struggling to prove that he was once great. He's struggling to remain faithful to the person he chose to become, someone who carries his responsibility to its final limit, even when the price of that responsibility is plainly written across his own body. If you want to keep stepping deeper into the story behind those honors, where greatness is purchased through silence, pain, and unwavering discipline, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss what comes next. If the first part was the instant the body demanded repayment for its debt, then this part compels us to return to the beginning, a place without alternatives or crossroads, where only a single road existed, and it was called discipline. Iván Rodríguez was born in Puerto Rico into a household where affection wasn't expressed through praise or embraces, but through expectations to be correct, to be sufficient, to never be wrong. His childhood left little room for distant dreams and almost no space to experiment or fail. Inside that home, his father didn't instruct him in how to dream. He taught him how to shoulder responsibility. Each morning, Iván learned that obligation outweighed emotion. Each night, he recognized that silence was the safest refuge. No one asked what he preferred or what he desired, because the only concern was whether he performed correctly. At an age when mistakes should have been permitted, Iván quickly grasped the errors didn't merely lead to punishment. They threatened his place within the circle of acceptance. In that environment, weakness was never treated as a natural human condition, that it was treated like a defect that needed correction, or worse, as evidence that you weren't fit to stand your ground. The boy Iván came to understand, with a chilling clarity, that survival required endurance first, and to be permitted to remain, he had to outlast the pain. No one ever sat him down to explain emotions. No one told him that fear was natural or that exhaustion could be excused. Instead, Iván learned to push those feelings inward, to pack them down the same way he would later contain pain during a game. Showing them on the outside meant exposing himself to weakness. In that household, discipline wasn't a gentle guide. It was a boundary that carved a person's shape. And from an age too young to grasp the cost, Iván was formed to fit neatly within it. He trained not out of enjoyment, but out of obligation. He stepped onto the field not from passion, but because it was the only ground he believed he was required to occupy. The endless practices, the rigid expectations, and the unforgiving glances slowly built a child who was quiet, restrained, and intensely self-controlled. Almost unsettling in that restraint, Iván didn't rebel or push back, because he recognized early that resisting discipline only multiplied the pain. So instead, he absorbed discipline into himself, turning it into part of his own being, until every order stopped feeling external and became an inner voice that refused to let him rest. That upbringing shaped someone who seldom complained, yet rarely discovered uncomplicated joy. He became so familiar with enduring that he failed to see he was enduring at all. While other children were encouraged to imagine their futures, Iván was taught to brace for disappointment. When others were comforted after mistakes, he learned to rise again without speaking. Inside that quiet absence of openly expressed love, a subtle tragedy began to take root. It wasn't dramatic or explosive, but steady and profound. He wasn't raised to live expansively, only to withstand pressure. He wasn't guided to listen to himself. He was conditioned to overcome himself, whatever the cost. Years later, when he knelt behind home plate, when his body absorbed the hardest collisions of baseball, when he continued to take the field in pain without a single complaint, that behavior wasn't merely the decision of a professional athlete. It was the instinct of a child who had learned early that endurance was the price of being allowed to exist, and that affection, if it arrived at all, always came last. That silence wasn't chosen in a single moment. It developed alongside Iván Rodríguez, spreading quietly through each day and every small reaction until it defined the only way of living he understood. He didn't resist, revolt, slam doors, or argue because he grasped early that in his world, speaking out didn't create safety. Silence did. Silence with his father, who stood as a stern measure of right and wrong, where every glance carried the demand to be sufficient, resilient, never fragile. Iván learned to agree instead of explain, to act rather than talk, to withstand rather than expose. He rarely asked why and never pleaded for extra chances, because questions tended to make the burden heavier. Over time, he realized his presence was accepted when he stayed out of trouble, completed what was required, and kept emotion from interfering with duty. There was silence with friends as well. Iván often didn't know what to say when his inner world left no room for ease. While other children laughed, shared stories, and imagined possibilities, he remained at the edge, watching with a quiet sense of not belonging. It wasn't that he lacked the desire to fit in. It was that no one had ever shown him how. Inside him, happiness was always tempered by caution, and intimacy arrived shadowed by the fear of being understood too completely. So he kept his distance by choice, positioning himself where no one questioned too deeply and no one demanded too much. The most profound and weighty silence, however, was the one he maintained with his own feelings. Iván taught himself not to label sadness, not to admit fear, and not to permit weakness even in his private thoughts. Whenever exhaustion crept in, he told himself it was simply another obstacle to defeat. Each moment of disappointment became, in his mind, a defect that required correction. In Iván's world, emotions weren't signals to hear. They were elements to control, to seal away carefully so they wouldn't disturb the steady cadence of discipline. Slowly, that boy vanished in a very specific sense, not from the view of others, but from his own awareness. His personality wasn't allowed space to expand. His desires were never encouraged to take shape, because anything unrelated to safety was treated as a potential threat. Iván grew dependable, compliant, and unwavering to a degree that reassured the adults around him. Yet the cost was a silent hollow where a personal voice should have existed. He fulfilled every expectation placed upon him, but seldom paused to ask what he himself wanted. That disappearance happened quietly. No alarm sounded, and no one recognized it, because outwardly Iván appeared to be the ideal child, diligent, disciplined, and never complaining. Inside, though, each layer of silence settled over the previous one, thickening year after year until it formed a shell so firm that even he struggled to penetrate it. Within that shell, Iván survived by ensuring he caused no disturbance to the world. In exchange, the world failed to reach him as well. It was an unspoken bargain, security purchased through self-erasure. He was never taught that feeling was his right. He was taught only that endurance was his obligation, and that seemingly modest decision to remain silent shaped everything that followed. Later, when Iván Rodríguez stood as a catcher, the role that carried the greatest burden on the field, stationed behind home plate and guiding the rhythm of the entire team, that silence served as an advantage. He stayed calm, steady, and unreadable, never allowing emotion to surface. At the same time, it hardened into an invisible enclosure that kept him locked inside the identity of the strong, controlled figure who endured without seeking understanding. The child who once learned to fade into the background matured into a man accustomed to standing on his own. Beneath the resilience lingered a muted sadness. His sense of safety had been bought at the expense of individuality, expression, and the freedom to exist fully as a person. From that point forward, the tragedy wasn't something awaiting him in the distance. It was already there in quiet form, waiting to be recognized later through the unspoken aches of the future. The subdued disappearance of his childhood and identity had barely settled when another doorway opened prematurely. Heavy, irreversible, and offering no path backward for Iván Rodríguez. At just 19, while many of his peers were still searching uncertainly for direction, he entered Major League Baseball with the weight of adulthood already on his shoulders. Tasked with responsibilities that normally required years to learn how to carry, Iván Rodríguez was denied a gradual apprenticeship. There was no protective space to stumble, adjust, and mature at a natural pace. He moved directly into the catcher's role, the most demanding position on the field, where every stare, every mistake, and every fragment of pressure concentrated on a single figure. A catcher does far more than receive pitches. He interprets the flow of the game, guides the pitcher, controls the tempo, oversees the defensive structure, and, perhaps most significantly, accepts the burden of failures that others are unwilling to claim. At 19, Iván barely had the chance to grasp what a career truly was. He hadn't even reached the point of fully calling himself an adult. Still, he was expected to behave like a pillar, the steady figure the entire team depended on to remain upright. No one paused to ask whether he felt prepared, because in that world, opportunity never waits for readiness, and responsibility pays no attention to age. Iván stepped onto the field with a body that was still youthful, a mind already trained to endure, and a silence that had hardened into his instinct for survival. Each time he crouched behind home plate, each time he rose to signal the pitcher, he wasn't only learning the mechanics of the game, he was learning how to conceal the fear of being revealed as someone still too young for the weight he carried. There was no mentor standing beside him to explain that mistakes were part of growth, because a catcher's errors are always amplified, remembered longer, and paid for immediately. Iván quickly understood that in this environment, no one waits for you to mature. If you aren't strong enough, someone else takes your place. So he forced the process, compressing his childhood and shaping himself into an adult before his inner life had time to follow. The pressure didn't arrive as a single dramatic shock. It flowed steadily, day after day, and game after game, demanding constant vigilance, control, and emotion sealed beneath dense layers of discipline. There was no room left for dreams or hesitation, since every game functioned like a public examination with thousands of eyes ready to judge Within that severity, Iván slowly surrendered the last fragile parts of himself in exchange for dependability. He became the reliable one, calm, precise, and rarely shaken. But what he paid was a maturity that had been rushed into existence, stripped of the gentleness a person needs to repair themselves. Entering Major League Baseball so early didn't only steal his carefree years, it placed him inside a relentless machine where stopping meant falling behind. Each time he returned to the field, he carried a quiet fear that any sign of weakness might bring the whole structure down. That fear hardened into a cold momentum that drove him forward, even as his body began to whisper the first hints of fatigue. The absence of an apprenticeship meant there was no permission to pause, and without permission to pause, there was no space for vulnerability. Iván trained himself to remain upright under pressure, to speak sparingly and act decisively, and never revealed that he was still learning while performing. He was required to become a pillar before he ever experienced being an ordinary child. That paradox etched itself deeply into the way he interpreted the world. Safety exists only for those strong enough to hold it. To observers, he appeared as an early rising talent, a young catcher overflowing with promise. Few recognized that beneath the composed exterior stood someone racing to grow up simply to avoid being swept aside. Iván never even had the time to consider who he wanted to become, because in a setting where daily survival already felt like a contest, such questions were luxuries. He was compelled to serve as a pillar before he was allowed to be an adult. From that instant on, the path in front of him stopped being a matter of choice and turned into the continuation of an assigned role. Carry the burden, remain silent, and stand firm, even though no one had ever stopped to ask if he was prepared. Once Iván Rodríguez had grown used to entering the field with the posture of someone forced into early adulthood, the catcher position revealed an even harsher lesson. Certain roles refuse to divide their weight among many shoulders. Catcher isn't where the spotlight shines first, but it's the place where every mistake eventually returns. Iván Rodríguez stepped into that responsibility as if entering a sealed chamber where pressure accumulates, with no outlet and no companion to share it. When a pitcher delivers a poor throw, the first glances shift toward the catcher. When strategy collapses, the question rises why the catcher failed to read the game. The scoreboard records the defeat, but inside the clubhouse, the catcher confronts the silent accusation first. What did you do wrong? Iván understood early that this position demanded far more than simple technical ability.